Councillor Brooker, you have a question for Zach Lombardo.
Yeah, take two. Look, Zach, you mentioned about the businesses in Nillumbik, mostly it seemed in the hospitality area, that were doing things particularly tough. I'm really interested if you could explain to me and the councillors about any rates freeze, how it would impact on them directly, because they don't directly pay rates. It's more that relief would be afforded to landlords, and then what process could be used so landlords could pass on any freeze to tenants.
Well, of course, thank you, Councillor. There's clearly three parties involved in that rental agreement. There's council, of course, levying rates on the landowner, and then the tenant, the business who's renting from the landowner as well. It's really about council being on the side of those businesses. It's the going concern in that tenancy, and providing them with the maximum available leverage for them to negotiate their rent. You'll be more across the actual capacity of council to enforce a rent reduction, which I would assume is nil. But certainly by setting that expectation that the relief provided by a rate increase, or a rate freeze rather, deferring the increase, expecting that relief will pass on to renters, which is the businesses in those tenancies, will put them in a very good position, I think, when considering the negotiation with their landlord. And I would say that from my own private dealings in other organisations that I'm involved in, this is not a renter's market for owners of commercial property at the moment. And I think that if they've got a going concern that's prepared to commit to renewing their lease, they'll be very inclined to do so on favourable terms, particularly if council has made the appropriate communications and made that undertaking to defer a rate increase.
Thanks very much, Zach. Any other questions from any other councillors? If not, we will move on to our next presenter. Thank you very much, Zach, for your presentation and your patience going through our first technical glitch.
Thank you.
And over to you, Carl, for our last two presentations, Norman Williams and then Mel Ellis.
Thank you, Mayor Egan. This is from Norman Williams. His submission reads, I represent a family company owning retail property in Eltham Town. The occupiers are Thompson's Pharmacy, possibly the oldest continuing retailer in the Shire, established in 1928, and Baker's Delight. The annual total rates for these two tenants is nearly $30,000, including state government fire services levy. Councillors would be aware that commercial leases generally pass outgoings such as council rates directly to the tenant. Last year, both tenants received a 15% reduction in rent because of the generally depressed retail environment, with several businesses closing during the previous 3 years. It was always my intention to put this information to council for rate relief. What was a problem then before COVID-19 is now an emergency. Both tenants have asked for and been granted further substantial rent relief. All commercial properties are valuable assets of the Shire and as such provide necessary rate revenue. However, if these assets continue to lose tenants, then in the medium to long term, it will represent a significant community loss, not just as a source of revenue, but a loss of employment, especially for our young people, and the inconvenience and cost to our community of not having a vibrant retail and commercial base to our Shire. A message delivered by the COVID-19 crisis is that all of us need to be more self-reliant, making it even more necessary to support our local retail and light industrial businesses. This is a responsibility of all levels of government, and I would respectfully ask that Council give urgent consideration for this request for commercial rate relief, which should be viewed as an investment in the Shire's future. Yours faithfully, Norman Williams, Director, and that is Norman's submission.
Thank you, Carl, and our final one from Mel Ellis.
Yep. Mel's submission. I do not support the lowering of registration fees for non-desexed dogs. The council should take a responsible position and maintain the higher fee to try and reduce the huge oversupply of pets we already have in Australia. Council pounds kill 240 pets every day on average. Councils should do whatever is in their power to discourage further breeding. A reduced fee will not encourage more people to register their pet. That should be done by offering more benefits and by communicating these benefits to the pet owners. It is an issue to be addressed in the domestic animal management plan, So please do not enable this needless killing. What other councils do should not be the decision criteria here. It should be what is the right thing to do for our pets and our people who care for them. We all want less pets in pounds. I understand that everyone with an entire pet will assume theirs won't get out of the yard or their puppies will be loved for the rest of their lives. Evidence does not support that. You can do your own research, go and ask 10 people down the dog park where they got their dogs from you, and they will be able to get a picture of the level of backyard breeding that goes on. I hope if there are councillors present with entire pets that this would be declared and considered a conflict of interest when this is voted on. Positive actions that could be added to the budget to save animal lives are improved/reduced registration process and fees for foster pets in the Shire, reducing the registration fees for rescue animals as the City of Knox does, compensation for our service providers who are charities for rehoming our dogs that are not collected, and finally, consider a cat de-sexing amnesty. Non-de-sex cats are an environmental disaster. Moira Shire have added $20,000 into their budget for this purpose, and that is Mel's submission.
Thank you very much, Carl. So that's the end of the submissions. So we go back to the original report. Can I have a mover for the motion FN 1220, consideration of submissions, draft budget 2021? Councillor Rankin.
So, Mayor, I think we'd like to add just a little bit into point number 1, if we may.
Yes.
To add the words in to include something along with a 0% rate increase.
Great. And can I have a second?
Seconded.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Councillor Rankin.
Thank you, Mayor. I think it's worthwhile that over the last 3.5 years that this particular council has been tarnished a couple of times that we don't listen to our residents. This is the draft submission tonight that we've put up, and it's been great that we've got such an inclusion and voice coming back from our community. I think it's worthwhile just going back over the history. First of all, when we came in just over 3.5 years ago, that the last group of councillors had an increase of somewhere around 25% of their rates over that 4 years. And that sure as hell is why I ran for council, because I was fed up with the rate increases that we kept on getting. We kept on getting these rate increases, and they kept on increasing year after year after year. This particular group, in our first year, we had a 0% rate increase. Our second year, it was only 1.95%, which was still 0.55% lower than the rate cap. In our third year, we had a 2.25% increase, which was still, again, 0.25% lower than the rate cap. Whilst we put into this particular budget a 2% increase, when this was drawn up, we had no idea that COVID-19 was hitting us. As this pandemic has gone through, there are many people that have lost their jobs. There are many businesses that are suffering. We've listened, we've taken it on board, and we're one of the only councils, I believe, that is actually going through with a 0% rate increase. That's going to be some welcome news for many, many residents around the Shire and for many businesses around the Shire as well. However, for the next term of council, whether it be us or whoever's in, is going to have a hard feat to be able to keep the budget on track. Whilst it's been great that we've been able to pass these reductions on, these are compounding effects that are going to continue now indefinitely for the next council and the next council after that. So it's going to be hard for the officers and the finance team to be able to ensure that they can keep a tight rein on the budget moving forward. And hopefully we'll still be here next year to be able to assist them in doing that. We've had some really good drivers over the last 3.5, 4 years, and we've been able to tighten the reins, reduce our debts, and reduce the cost and improve the efficiencies within the organisation. And we're in such a position that we've been able to now put forward this 0% rate increase. So I thank the officers for their hard work, and I know it's been very challenging, particularly for the finance team over the last few weeks, to try and have a look at how we can do this. And I think they've been up for the challenge, and I think it's going to come through. So councillors, I ask you all to please think, and I know that there are some that are sceptical that we shouldn't be putting through a 0% rate increase, and I was one of those a couple of weeks ago. But I think that it's a really important part to our community and to our ratepayers. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rankin. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, councillors. Well, it's not surprising you that I want to support this recommendation. I commenced this conversation in January at the start of the budget deliberations about not having any increase and got no support whatsoever. There is lots of arguments to put up rates. 2% increase is about $1.15 million. And the argument is often put, oh, well, that's, 10 or in this case, it'll be about $14 million over a 10-year period, and we're giving away the opportunity to spend that money. Equally, this is $14 million over the next decade in the hands of our community. It's very easy to spend money. And that was the dilemma of the council, trying to get to this point of contemplating not a rate increase, because it always wants to spend it. I'm quite happy to be open about, I certainly started this conversation wanting to not proceed with a with a EBA increase in this year for all staff. That in itself would have saved $730,000. I still think it is wrong that this council is considering an EB increase for staff in a circumstance where half the community is out of work. I don't think our council officers, at the end of the day, would begrudge the council wanting to go into that conversation, but I understand other councillors don't want to do that. Equally, I think it's reprehensible we didn't get the $500,000 from the federal government for the hockey pavilion. So in essence, if we're going to go down to 0 rate increase in the way some councillors want to do it, this is going to require some borrowings, probably up to $1 million. That's not unusual in these circumstances, but still, in my view, should be sought to be avoided. And we'll continue to have this debate. We're still at the submission of draft submissions. And I commend all of those that have submitted, because there's lots of still good ideas to look within that. We've still got some work to do. I think Mr. Lombardo's submission is probably likely to have the greatest area of success. The question is, how do we not spend the money to do a zero rate increase. That's still the work ahead of us. Just to go, I will borrow $1 million and we've only saved 150,000 out of recurrent is the easy way. And that's the easy way we're taking at the moment. So I'm still up for the harder conversation, have been so for the last 5 months. And it's taken 5 months to get to the point of this direction of a zero rate increase. That's not to say rates won't go up for some. They clearly will, because it's based on valuations and we'll have an increase in the waste levy. So the dollars will still be greater for some. There will be less for others. But this is the direction we should be going. We should have started there, not trying to finish there. And I reckon we've still got a lot of work to go. And I thank the community for its submissions. And I hope we'll continue the good work right up to when we adopt a budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Any other councillors wish to speak? Councillor Perkins. Having trouble unmuting you, Councillor Perkins. Can you do it yourself?
Yep. Perhaps it's best if the speaker now been muted again.
No, you're not muted.
Rightio. It keeps flicking up. I've been muted. I've been unmuted by the host. Look, happy to support the motion. Taking issue with a couple of things that have been put by Councillor Rankin in terms of, I don't know what Councillor Rankin was doing 4, 6, 8, 10 years ago, but I know what I was doing. I was here, and I was on those councils that did put the rates up for good reasons over a number of years. You know, the rates went up after the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires. We saw an increase in the fuel mitigation works going from about $200,000 a year up closer to $1,800,000 a year. That's had a compounding effect. There was a super call that council had to find some money for. There was an increase in services generally across the board. But what we've seen over those rate increases, and that's history for us now, but they're the compounding effects that have now provided us the opportunity to potentially freeze the rates this year. If that work hadn't been done by previous councils, there's no way that we would be in the strong position we are at the moment, where we can potentially freeze the rates and hold 0%. So I think it's just a little bit disingenuous to continually bag on and admonish previous councils, you know, when we weren't there. You know, I was there, I know what went on. And as some councils might find in years to come, when you move on and you cease to become a councillor for whatever reason, that you might consider it to be unfair, the way that you might be criticised by people who weren't actually involved in those conversations and didn't know what went on. So I think it's just time, you know, 4 years in, to stop banging on about previous councils, you know, to take leadership for where we are and who we are, and we're the Nillumbik Council now, and we make our own decisions and leave the discussion about previous councils alone. You know, 4 years in, I'm well and truly sick of it. In terms of what needs to happen, certainly borrowings, I'm happy to support 0% on the basis that we borrow, you know, a large portion of that money. I'm happy to look at a bit of a shandy, you know, some minor effect on capital works, but I think borrowing has to be where it goes. In terms of the draft budget, I think that the draft budget needs to clearly identify fees and charges that are outside of our remit. You know, there are some discretionary fees and charges, and there's some that are not. A lot of them we actually have no say in it, and I think we should make a note in the budget highlighting what fees and charges we could potentially take up or down, because I think, well, we know that a lot of them are out of our control, but that's not clearly identified to the people who read our budgets. The reduction in CAT fees, that was never supposed to be going to the draft budget. That was never considered by council in discussion around the draft budget. It was a reduction in registration fees for entire dogs, bringing those fees down from 200 down, or from 300 down to 200, on the basis that, you know, it's 200 is 4 times what it would cost you if your dog was registered, and 6 times too much. And I've had my say, and I thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Perkins. Any other councillors wish to speak? Councillor Booker, of course. There you go.
Thank you. The budget as amended does recommend a 0% rate rise. The real question is how it gets to that number. To do so, council can either make operational savings, and that's a euphemism, that word savings, but it does actually mean, you know, you have to change service levels, you have to make reductions in service levels to achieve those savings. You have to delete or defer some items of capital expenditure, or you can delete or defer an area of new spending that we call new initiatives, or you can borrow. We can borrow some of the money for the capital expenditure in this budget, and that is what it is proposed to do. The problem with that is when your revenues aren't increasing by any great margin, and in Nillumbik our revenues aren't increasing by any great margin, you certainly do make an impact in the future. You have to make the interest payments, so it does shift costs to future ratepayers. You do have less choices going forward because you don't have the amount of cash that you would otherwise have. And what we're talking about is an additional $1.3 million in borrowings, and that's an additional $1.3 million on top of the borrowings we already have. So that 1.3 million will be debt funded from this budget. Is that manageable? Yes, but it does come with some consequences for our successors. I think the real question is not, can we do it? Yes, we can. Ought we do it? That is really the question we need to answer. All that said, you know, the total budget is around $100 million, including waste services charges, rates, grants from federal and state. So what we're having a final issue with is the final $1.3 million of that budget. It's not my preferred approach to borrow that money. Deferring capital expenditure isn't necessarily, you know, a cost-free decision. You don't have the assets you would otherwise have. However, the principle is if you want to deliver 0% rate rise, you need to make some decisions around outlays. And you ought not borrow to achieve that objective. Borrowing the final 1.3 million to deliver all of your CapEx is not the best long-term choice for the residents of Nillumbik. It's great now, but the future costs of this decision and its impact on future budgets are something
Okay. If no other councillors wish to speak, we will go into a vote. Can we have a full screen, please? Oh, sorry, Councillor Ashton, I didn't see you waving your hand there. It's flickering in and out of your background.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
As all councillors know, the rural areas will have the most rate increase this year. Rural property prices have increased substantially more than the urban property prices. Over the last few years, Sugarloaf Ward has been the second largest contributor to rates in the Shire. With regard to what we get for our rates, I think Councillor Eagle and myself will struggle to justify to our residents exactly what we give them. North Warrandyte continually has road and drainage issues. We have issues with weeds, with roadside trees that probably need to be checked due to fire hazard issues. It's ongoing out here. The massive pieces of infrastructure that we have seen in Eltham and Diamond Creek, people out here, yes, we can use them, but we don't get very much. And I'm really happy if we borrow money, and I'm really happy if we make sure we don't impact on our staff. Our staff have done an incredible job over the last 3 months and continue to do so. How we can talk about implementing the Disability Action Plan, the Economic Development Plan, and at the same time challenge the EBA, which is only halfway through its cycle. I don't understand. I really, you know, as far as rural people are concerned, we've always been on the back foot. Budgets come and go. We see very little out of them. We tend to pick up anything that the state government or our officers can find for us with regards to funding. So I think it's a good budget. I agree, 0% will be good, particularly for rural residents who are going to have to pay higher rates anyway. So yeah, I look forward to how we look at the submissions, how we try and work what the residents have said into our final budget. Yep, let's see what we get back in May. Thank you. Sorry, at the end of May.
Thank you, Councillor Ashton. Can we have a full screen, please? Thank you. Now we still have to vote. So all those in favour? And that is carried. Thank you, councillors. We move on to our last item of the night, which is FN 1320, the Nillumbik Housing Strategy Discussion Paper, consideration of community feedback, and we have 7 presenters. The first submitter will be Tim Phillips on behalf of ECAG. Is Tim in the room? Won't be a moment, everybody. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
We're not going to see your face?
Maybe now?
Yes, got you now. Fantastic.
Okay. Thank you. The housing discussion paper, which is what we're talking about today, sets the scene for the up-and-coming housing strategy. The housing strategy will indicate directions from professional council officers and others in council. This strategy also requires public input, like what we're having tonight, and we applaud any recommendation for the release of this draft housing strategy as well for comment. In part, at least for Eltham, the housing strategy has been partly preempted by the Eltham Activity Draft Structure Plan, and this needs to be acknowledged by council and impacts the scope of any housing strategy. Within the draft housing discussion document, it's clear that we have increased housing needs. Some adaptation is required, for example, for ageing communities, while maintaining a flexible and diverse housing mix to accommodate a thriving and functional community. We know we can't generalise Greater Melbourne needs to be the same as ours. For example, population growth will be likely to be much less in Nillumbik than the average Greater Melbourne growth. In the document as well, we noticed that some of the assumptions behind the modelling of the future household type were unstated. It would be good to see these figures unpacked, for example, to estimate future dwelling types needed. It would also be good to see the impact of the number and types of dwellings permitted but not yet built, and also current potential dwelling sites or types on satisfying the projected increase in households. The situation might appear a bit different than it's stated. We see lots of positives and opportunities with regard to meeting housing requirements. There appears considerable opportunity to largely meet housing demand in currently annexed development areas, and an opportunity exists to encourage development in these areas with excellent livability, building environmental performance and response to social needs. It's also possible to strengthen elements in plans such as the Eltham Activity Centre Structure Plan and at the same time, the related planning scheme elements can be amended. In conclusion, we still have lots of challenges relating to this. The definition and respect of neighbourhood character is still a challenge, particularly when it comes to VCAT hearings.
Thanks, Tim.
There's also, just a couple more points, there's also considerable old housing stock, which is a challenge, and a reliance on commercial developers to lead development is a bit, needs strong guidance.
Thank you. Time's up.
Thank you.
Councillors, any questions for Tim, please? Councillor Clark.
Sorry, I was trying to get unmuted. Tim, I take it that broadly you're saying ECAG supports the thrust that this is heading in as a reasonably controlled outcome.
Well, the basis of the discussion paper is more background. The proof of any sort of success of this document is what's coming into the next document, which is the housing strategy. So I suppose, in short, you know, we support the discussion document as is. There are some issues with it, which we've outlined in writing, but the crux is how it's put into the next document, which is the housing strategy.
Thank you.
Any more questions from councillors? Councillor Perkins.
Hi, Tim. I hope you can hear me. Just one of my concerns with the way things are heading is that I believe that the neighbourhood character study should have been done first. Now, you mentioned neighbourhood character, and certainly Eltham, large parts of Eltham are somewhat protected by having overlays, like a significant landscape overlay, to try to protect that semi-bush or garden court or bush garden look and feel of Eltham. But would you agree that given that Eltham's the only part of Nillumbik that actually has significant landscape overlays that provide these protections, it's appropriate to do that work first for the whole of the Shire, or certainly for the urban parts of the Shire? So, you know, we can have a housing strategy that treats ratepayers of Nillumbik equally.
I would support any documentation of a sort of broad consulted neighbourhood character study. I noticed on the planning scheme document there's a 1997 document which relates to the sort of Eltham character, for example, and a 22-year-old document is just not really that great, for example, to reflect current thinking. So I don't know about the order, but certainly there can be sort of, you know, a whole Shire-wide perspective on neighbourhood character.
Well, certainly the argument's certainly been put, and I continue to put it, that a neighbourhood character study and policy, an updated one, would help inform the housing strategy, and it should be that order, because otherwise you're trying to undo something that's already done.
That would be helpful, but there may be something that I don't know about in the wings from the council. I don't know, but yes, I support your general idea.
Any other questions from any other councillors? Councillor Demerick.
Tim, you've talked about the issues of using some of our policies to defend things at VCAT. What do you see the major flaws are?
Well, at VCAT, one of the issues relates to just the documentation, and the more up to date, for example, the sort of planning scheme documents are, the better ammunition anybody has to argue for or against a particular perspective. There have been some incidents where some elements of the planning scheme have been out of date, and that has caused a bit of an issue at VCAT. neighbourhood character seems to always get a bit of a beating in terms of what is it and how does it reflect, how is it reflected in residential development, for example. So any updates in the planning scheme are sort of, I think one of the first steps, looking perhaps as a new resident might at the planning scheme, finding a 1997 document is not a good look for the council.
Thank you. Councillor Clark.
Jim, I just wanted to sort of touch on this, and I ask it as a question, but it's somewhat a rhetorical question. Are you aware that the council in the last 3.5 years has not lost a case in Eltham at VCAT? We've won everything that we have argued there. And neighbourhood character, we've been able to argue based on our current planning scheme and win every debate.
I don't know about the winning aspect, because I can think of a case in Diamond Street where that outcome was not necessarily consistent with what council was looking for. So I haven't done a broad study, but I'm not sure about that statistic. And I still think that if you're at VCAT, you get some pretty tiresome detail about what is not neighbourhood character. And I suppose I want to focus on the residential aspect of this, because it's about making livable places that do respect, that neighbourhood character and have, that flexibility and that accommodation for types of real estate that do allow for ageing in place or disabilities, for example.
Yeah, I agree with that. But can I also just comment on, and I don't know whether you've got a view on it, but certainly one of the greater concerns about planning and housing in the Eltham end has been the 1030 rule, where people utilise that reducing tree canopy. That's a state government regulation, one which we don't control under the planning scheme, and that's been our greatest issue, I think, in the Eltham end. I don't know whether you've got a view about that.
I would agree that that's a crazy situation where council policy is contrary to fire-related policy. I can understand the fire suppression issues related to anything about having too much fuel load, but to notice that, one side of the border of Bolton Street, there's a particular regime for trees, and on the other side, there's not a particular regime for trees. So that is an issue. It seems like it's almost like a developer green light for removal of trees. And that's a particular issue for protecting neighbourhood character that I see the council really must do something about.
ECAG, given that I agree, and that's what we're writing to the Minister about, but ECAG's principal tenet being around planning type issues, I encourage you to research and happy to assist you in verifying that in Eltham we're batting at 100% at the moment at VCAT.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Councillor Perkins.
Tim, just broadly, do you have a view, if I put to you, what would you think about medium density housing, medium density residential housing right up to the edge of the urban growth boundary in areas where it interfaces with rural conservation zone? So, the edge of the green wedge. Do you think it's appropriate to have medium density housing up to that point?
Good question. I actually left out a bit related to that, so I'm glad you brought that up. Essentially, medium density housing needs to be focused, and there's an opportunity in activity areas or activity centres in Diamond Creek and in Eltham, for example. And so I wouldn't recommend medium density development right up to the edge of the, that boundary, the urban growth boundary you talked about. It needs to be cleverly put. It can efficiently use land surface for residential and other kinds of development, but it should not, particularly with respect to the neighbourhood character of this, a lot of this area, should not be wholesale across the area and doesn't need to be, I don't think, to accommodate the projected increase in dwelling requirements for the current or near future.
So could I summarise by saying perhaps it might be appropriate to have, you know, the highest density residential living closest to the activity centre, and you know, have a lessening, you know, near the urban growth boundary. So it should almost sort of work in reverse. You shouldn't have high density near the urban growth boundary. All that's going to do is put pressure on movement of the urban growth boundary into the future and destroy the green wedge.
I think that Melbourne in general's under pressure for accommodating population growth. Nillumbik has to play its part. I couldn't tell you the transition between the city of Melbourne, where, you know, the density has to be the highest, obviously, and out here. However, there needs to be nodes of development, and you'd all agree that nodes of development based around walkable distances, walkable, livable areas are really important things to encourage for Melbourne.
I suppose the question, Tim, was relating to the urban growth boundary around that Nillumbik has around our, you know, our major townships, you know, and that interface between that urban growth boundary and the rural conservation zone that it adjoins. Is
there an actual question there, Councillor Perkins? I'm not sure.
Oh no, I just wondered whether Tim supports that view that you shouldn't have, you know, the urban growth boundary shouldn't be have high density residential living right on its edge, because all that does is encourage, you know, future movement of the urban growth boundary.
To respond, there always needs to be a transition between zones.
Yep.
So no to development right up to your urban growth boundary or high density development.
Any other questions from any other councillors? If not, thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.
We now have Howard Bartlett in the room. And final submitter in person. Won't be a moment, everybody. You with us, Howard? No mic yet. Hi, Howard. We can see you. Can you hear us? Got you. You need to get your microphone button. Slight technical problem, everybody. Won't be a moment. In television land, we would throw to a commercial.
Happy to provide an ad if you need one.
Does he know he's got to accept his microphone? Pardon? He hasn't got a microphone. I see. You are? I think we've lost Howard. We'll try and get him back. In the meantime, I'll throw to you, Mr. CEO, with some of our other submissions. So it is over to the CEO, Carl Cowie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. This is a submission from Gilla Schnapp, and it reads as follows. If council fails to immediately initiate a planning scheme amendment to include these lands as general residential, irrespective of any final site-specific land use, the consequences for our lands and our family will be devastating. Council's new housing strategy 2030 cannot be separated from that of Diamond Creek 2020 and interrelated Merinda Doreen structure plans. The former discriminatorily and wrongly omitted our lands. All previous commitments to others must be honoured with our inclusion now. With dual supply of urban reticulated infrastructure and dual road frontages, all needs and objectives of this housing strategy can be achieved. In addition to the conventional residential subdivision, the 60 acres can provide for retirement homes, retirement village, small groups of homes with generous open space, medium density, dual occupancy, group housing, as or our numerous applications to council demonstrate. Unless council acts now, our precious infrastructure and its urban capacity will or may be inequitably eroded, diverted to others according to council's current, old and new policies and strategies. In particular, this housing strategy and its emphasis on housing within the activity centres. Financial and amenity exploitation will result in major losses and damages to our family. Our accrued urban reticulated infrastructure and interrelated rights to subdivide these lands into residential lots must be honoured now. Furthermore, council, please immediately ensure that your strategies and policies guarantee our inclusion in the major urban reticulated infrastructure augmentation and upgrades currently outside our door on Ironbark Road. The direct connection between the infrastructure and the land's correct urban status cannot be denied. It was and still is strategic to Diamond Creek, Plenty and Yarrambat, and this was the very reason it became urban to begin with. It is not acceptable to make new strategic decisions from the activity centre that knowingly exclude these lands as general residential. It is not a matter of council determining their preferred housing locations. New goalposts and criteria are irrelevant in our case, but are rather an obligation on their part to release our lands for urban housing. They have a duty of care and trust to do so. Our water pressures and flows of 2,100 kPa is crucial to bushfire protection. These lands were orchards and heavily farmed. All original vegetation was removed. In our case, human life must take precedent over newly introduced flora and fauna. Almost finished. Should there be any shire boundary changes, we demand to be returned to the city of Banyule and not gerrymandered out to the city of Whittlesea. Previous hard evidence submitted to council, the latest being in October 2019, that indisputably proves our case, including that known and ought to be known can no longer be ignored. And that is Gilla's submission.
Thank you very much, Carl. And as we can't ask questions of Gilla, that is the end of her submission there. We've got Howard Bartlett back in our waiting room, so we'll welcome Howard and go back to him. Hopefully we've sorted out our issues now. Welcome, Howard.
Thank you.
You there, Howard?
Two monsters.
We can see you. Have you got your microphone activated? You need to accept. Can you give him a chat? I'm sorry, we're still having technical difficulties. Howard, can you nod your head if you can hear me, please? No, you can't. Right, can you send him a message? I'm sorry. We'll have to go back to you, Carl, and go on to Esther Caspies while we try and...
Yeah, can I just make the comment that we need to stop the Esther Caspy submission at 3 minutes, not just how long she writes for?
You took the words right out of my mouth. Thank
Thank
you, Councillor Clark. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you, councillors. To be fair to Esther, hers will fit within the 3 minutes. Thank you, CEO, for reading this out today. Regarding materially impacted serviced properties of 175 to 199 Ironbark Road, Diamond Creek, 201 to 219 Ironbark Road, Diamond Creek, and in view 40 to 60 Pioneer Road, Yarrambat, and like properties similarly endowed in this distinctive urban catchment. Equitable and sustainable economic decisions are especially important in these difficult times. Serviced land like these above must be released immediately and not frozen or sterilised from their highest and best use sustainably, and be entitled to use their established urban reticulated infrastructure and capacity, not to provide free amenity or services to others at our expense. Aired rural planning for above lands is in conflict with the costly infrastructure payments and certainty of financial planning. Correction to the general residential zoning best promised closest fit zone translation in 2000 will enable diverse variety and density of land uses, including single dwellings, medium density housing, Baugruppen development in Fremantle. Dual occupancy, duplexes, villa. Please amend your medium density housing opportunities map 2 to include above lands and in view this distinctive urban infrastructure catchment. Our strategic services and planning were coordinated. Payments were mandatory, not voluntary, urban, not rural, information evidence or urban establishment of services has been continuously provided. Rates were urban, not rural. Please recognise this now, and that is Esther's submission.
Thank you, Carl. We next have Fred Bauer.
Thank you, Mayor. Fred's is very brief. Can Council provide a written response to our submission of the 15th of March? Yes, we can. Fred will do that. Do you want me to go on to the next one?
I'll stop you there. I think we've got Howard back in. We'll give it one last try and see if we can connect Howard. Welcome, Howard. Nod if you can hear me. And can you talk so that we can hear you?
Can you hear me?
Fine, that's great. Welcome.
Sorry about it. I don't know what happened, but I've got the phone here as well. So
You've got 3 minutes, so fire away, and then councillors may ask you some questions after that.
okay. First of all, congratulations on the housing strategy discussion paper. It has identified the accident going somewhere to happen. An oversupply of family housing, which has been built up over generations, and a shortage of accommodation for people that are described as couples with no children and single people. I raise an issue from chapter 3 where I quote, "The housing industry responds to consumer demand." This should more correctly be worded, "It responds to express demand," a block of land, and to fund the ongoing obligation of a mortgage. So there's a lot of people left out of that equation. They don't participate. Therefore, I would argue that the housing industry does not serve them well. My submission is a copy of a paper delivered to the Planning and Building Regulation Review in December, and it relates to the same set of regulations that affect Nillumbik. The regulations, the planning scheme and the building regulations are identical. I just want to give a little bit of background about my history. I started work as a land developer's draftsman. I later worked as a strategic planner in Berwick, and then eventually I worked as a project manager with the Urban Land Authority, working on many large solve a problem that I previously built in Endeavour Hills as a subdivider's draftsman. In Endeavour Hills, we complied with council's policies relating to lot size, and of course, large volumes of new families moved in and had families and occupied the school, and resulted in a large overflow of accommodation or school enrolments. With this large project in Berwick, I was able to work with my colleagues from the Berwick Council to vary the lot sizes and prices to accommodate a wide range of demographics at the beginning, rather than relying on redevelopment of existing houses. This practice has been recorded in the paper, and I'm happy to answer any questions. There's techniques that council can use to bring this new housing into reality.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Howard. Can I have a full screen, please, and hand it over to councillors for any questions of Howard? Councillor Ashton.
Hi, Howard. Thank you for your submission and your speaking tonight. I'm from the UK originally, and they had a lot of challenges over there with social housing and with trying to get away from, you know, basically huge council estate. And you know, each time I went back, there was sort of much more cluster housing. Do you see that there's an opportunity for us to do that sort of thing in Nillumbik?
I would make it very simple and suggest that the conversion of existing house lots into multiple dwellings can be facilitated. In line with the previous speaker, I believe they should be located within 400 metres of community facilities, particularly transport and shops. But the most important thing to realise is that the new housing can be made to measure, or it can be off the shelf. The existing planning scheme requires plans of multi-units to be stamped before the owners and occupiers are identified. So in effect, the people that are moving into these areas have no say in the budget or the finishes or the infrastructure that should be included in the dwelling. So they're passive, they're not active participants in housing. What I'm suggesting is that small titles with building envelopes, with no building, their vacant blocks can be made available, and the council can assess if you have a siting policy which relates to building envelope and orientation, that can be assessed by the building surveyor. All this has been done before. I can provide examples. I've involved about seven or eight projects across Melbourne where we had the council assess the architecture after the title's issued. So we're actually dealing with the team owner, builder, designer, but the order is owner, designer, builder. At the moment, the relationship is builder, designer, and the owner's introduced last.
Any other questions from Councillor Ashton? Is that it? Councillor Perkins.
Thank you. Howard, I'm just trying to, unfortunately, officers have redacted so much information that we can't work out who's who in the submitter. Historically, they would take your address out, but they've taken all the names out as well. So we can't actually, I'm trying to work out which is your submission, but you may well be submitter 10. Is it a review into the Victoria's building and planning approvals process and early building works infrastructure? Does it start that way?
Yes.
Yes, it's page 342 onwards.
Okay, and how'd you know that? Have we got a list somewhere of who's who in the zoo? Or?
I just read it.
Yeah.
It's called Housing Delivery Victoria or Home
Yeah, no,
Delivery Victoria.
I've got your one, but it's just there's a difficulty in terms of we can't easily identify who's made the submission.
Well, it's a copy of a submission made to the state government, so it's actually just submitted for information because we haven't actually had a response yet from the state government.
Okay, yep. Thanks, Howard.
Any other questions from any other councillors? If not, thank you very much, Howard. I'm sorry for the issues that we had. We've now got two of you on the screen.
Thanks.
And we'll go back to you, Carl, for our last, please, from Colleen Hackett and then Lawrence Smith.
Thank you, Mayor Egan. The next submission is from Colleen Hackett. And Councillor, she thanks you for the opportunity to hear the submission, which starts with, may I remind you that Hurstbridge is a rural township in Nillumbik's Green Wedge, and the vast majority of its residents want to retain its township status. Development should occur within the urban growth boundary and not, as stated in your document, in and around townships and activity centres. There is no appetite for medium density development in Hurstbridge, as was made abundantly clear in the debacle that was Lot 1 Grey Sharps Road. Lumping the Hurstbridge township in with the two major activity centres of Eltham and Diamond Creek is misleading and inappropriate. Please let me explain the concept of ageing in place. For the vast majority of people, this means aging in their own homes with government assistance if required. They feel safe and secure in their own homes where they can welcome their friends and family and grandchildren without any restrictions, present exceptions notwithstanding. Using the concept of ageing in place to justify the further development of aged care facilities in the Green Wedge when statistics do not demonstrate such a need is immoral. Perhaps the inclusion of this proposal in the document reflects the intense lobbying of council and councillors by one Green Wedge land speculator to thus develop his property. It is noteworthy that the existing aged care facility in Wattle Glen is an emergency services nightmare for first responders. The present council's desire for development in the Green Wedge, pressured as it is by a minority group of landowners, is contrary to the state planning scheme. It goes against the recommendations of the Bushfires Royal Commission, which argued against putting more people in harm's way in bushfire-prone areas. The concepts of 1030 and 1050 are meaningless on days like Black Saturday when houses burnt down in the middle of paddocks. It also causes further loss of biodiversity and habitat, a major cause of extinctions of flora and fauna in Australia, where we hold the world record for the number of extinctions. Bogruppen, which I have not pronounced well again, in Fremantle, housing is just another weasel word for cluster development, which is not permitted in the Green Wedge by state planning policy. The ad hoc development of apartments and high-rise housing in Eltham is a disgrace, and the photos provided in the document do not inspire much hope for the future of architecture in Australia. These appallingly ugly developments are not appropriate for our leafy suburbs. Thank you. And that is Colleen's submission.
Excuse me, Carl, I might just stop you there because we're nearly at 10:30 and I'll need a mover to go into extended time.
Move extended time.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. And could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Brooker, all those in favour? And that is carried. And I'll go back to Carl now for our last written submission from Warner Smith.
I won't get this one done in 3 minutes. I can tell you that for nothing, but I'll do my best with it.
Stop at 3 minutes, in fairness to others.
Yeah, just 3 minutes is what they're allowed, and that's it.
That's fine. Aging in place has been hijacked in this paper to describe the ability of older residents to move from their home to somewhere else in Nillumbik as they age, maybe for a smaller house and garden, more nearby facilities, and easier lifestyle. That is not ageing in place. The Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute defines ageing in place as follows under the heading Ageing in Place. The preferred option of most older Australians is to remain in their homes for as long as possible and until their changing circumstances necessitate a move to an assisted care environment. The home represents a combination of personal and financial security, family memories, and a sense of place and well-being. This is an important positive value in familiarity with the house, the neighbourhood, and the people in the local community. The vast majority of older people live in houses selected decades earlier when they were in the paid workforce and had larger houses. Their use of dwellings and areas does change when children leave home and after widowhood in old age, but few people adjust their housing after retirement unless they eventually can no longer drive or maintain their homes. The desire by older Australians to remain in their home is supported by Australian governments, not only in the form of favourable tax, capital gains, and pensions treatments, winter 1999, but also in terms of aged care policy by providing assistance with activities such as property maintenance, personal care, healthcare, and household tasks. Government agencies may provide services directly or purchase them from other formal providers. There are also technological advances which make it possible for older people to make alterations to their home to enable them to live longer independently. Given that around 90% of older Australian residents desire to live in their homes, council should be directing their activities to support this. Those few who do wish to downsize have plenty of existing units and dual occupancies to choose from, but few seem to be taking up the option. Related to this issue is an expressed desire from some landowners in the rural conservation zones for a relaxation of permits to allow for the construction of separate family dwellings for older family members to share the property with adult family members. This is subdivision by stealth. There is already provision for dependent person living units under the current provisions. These can be quite large and importantly can be removed when no longer required. While the report states the number of places available in assisted living accommodation in Nillumbik, it fails to include the overabundance of places on the borders of the municipality. There are vacancies at many of these facilities. I find it alarming that the report refers to Hurstbridge as a minor activity centre, which it is not. There are designated major activity centres at Eltham and Diamond Creek, not at Hurstbridge, which just does not have the capacity for the sort of growth of these areas. Hurstbridge is a rural township with a strong urban growth boundary, and at the last census, a slightly declining population, which has had little growth for 20 years.
Thank you, Carl, very much. And that's our final submitter for the community feedback on the housing strategy. So over to you, Councillor Clark.
I wish to move the recommendation in accordance with the papers proposed tonight.
Thank you. And a seconder? Councillor Rankin. Councillor Clark.
I just want to pick up a couple of points in the submission. I mean, broadly, we've got some useful submissions which we will have a look at, but the cynicism which continues to be conveyed by some usual suspects needs to be called out. All of what is proposed here is within the urban growth boundary. We are proposing nothing outside of the urban growth boundary. So those that want to argue a different case, read the document. This is a minimalist response to the state government requirement to have a housing policy. The change that would come out of this would almost be, is so infinitesimally small that it's hardly going to be recognisable. Yet people seem to be arguing a case that we're going to have 5-storey units going up in Hurstbridge, which is an absolute nonsense. So I do get tired of those that want to run these arguments that do not exist on the basis of scaring others. It is unfair. For those that also might be listening in, like our good friends Gillis Schnapp and Esther Caspi, ring the Premier. For the 99th time, you cannot have general residential zones in a green wedge area. We won't do it. No one will do it. Give up. stop writing the same ridiculous commentary, which you know is illegal and no government minister will support. You waste our time on a continuing basis, knowing that you are wrong. And frankly, it's just infuriating that you continue to continue to know the story, but not recognise it. This is a document which has got a serious amount of research that sits behind it. And still some, I think, will be frightened in part, sometimes by the commentary put out by others, but in part by some of the terminology. I think we're going to have a review of the document in some of its terminology because it talks about medium density, which again, some people might think are 3 and 4 level type apartments, which are not going to be the case outside of activity centres. The whole purpose of this document is about containing any serious development within the activity centres so that the balance of the Shire does not have to wear the burden of any serious medium density development. What is proposed is the requirement under the state strategies that we have to have a housing strategy that deals with some of our growth, some of the smallest growth in all of Victoria. But it does need to recognise that other parts of the Shire will have some small changes. And how we clarify what those small changes are, we need to get a terminology which means what it means. That is, that it's going to be possible in some areas that you can have a dual occupancy development or 2 units on a lot. Because with an ageing in population, we do have to provide other accommodation. The problem for our Shire in many respects are the outlier type issues. One of the growths, unfortunately, is those people having dementia. And if you have serious dementia, to be able to suggest you can just live in your house on your own is not realistic. And Ahuri, who has been quoted by Lorna and others, recognises that in their documents. So how you deal with some of those problems of people with effectively serious illness trying to reside in their communities will continue to be a problem. Or those, as we dealt with earlier on tonight, with serious disability, who, may well have, in a more simplest form, may well simply have Down syndrome, but might be getting to 40 or 50 years of age and their parents in their 80s no longer with us. How do they continue to be supported by way of housing opportunities within their local community? These are the real challenges that we need to be able to deal with in these sort of documents and coordinate with our other strategies. But I really just wanted to outline to those that want to run scare tactics, this is not about a massive growth in this Shire. It is not. It is about infinitesimal change to comply with a state government policy, recognising that we want all of the growth in activity centres and not elsewhere. And so this, we will listen to the commentary that is had and come back with a further document to go out for more public consultation, and hopefully we'll get together a really good housing strategy for Nillumbik going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Councillor Rankin. You don't wish to speak? Any other councillors wish to speak? Councillor Perkins.
Well, I certainly won't be supporting this motion. And I certainly don't support what Councillor Clark has said and the aggression with which he said it. This is far from a minimalist response. This is certainly not infinitesimally small, certainly not in my area that I represent in Diamond Creek. It's a massive change. It's a change to Diamond Creek that's been unprecedented. You've got, and look, I have had the benefit of looking at the next draft document. It's the draft Nillumbik housing strategy, and I was appalled at that document. It leads on from this one. It's highlighted to me even more the fact that we haven't had a neighbourhood character study since 1997. The neighbourhood character study and significant landscape overlays over all of the urban areas of Nillumbik should precede this document, should precede this whole discussion, because where we're heading is to have increasing density, medium density, for the whole of Diamond Creek. Substantial change across the whole of Diamond Creek on the inside of the urban area. Medium density housing right up to the urban growth boundary, right up to that rural conservation zone. This document has turned its back completely on the green wedge, that we still, hold in our brand new logo. it turns its back on any consideration for what sort of infrastructure is required to service, this increase in population. And we're not looking at an increase in planning for an increase in population as per the state government guidelines that we've been briefed on. We're actually planning for something that is 4 times more than that. So this is a massive change. The significant landscape overlay work has to be done. It's not fair that some parts of the Shire have SLOs and other parts don't. I know certainly parts of Councillor Rankin's ward doesn't have significant landscape overlays at all. Certainly all of Councillor Brooker's ward doesn't have any significant landscape overlays. None of my ward has significant landscape overlays. A lot of Councillor Jumrick's ward doesn't have significant landscape overlays. What the housing strategy says is basically those areas with the significant landscape overlays will get minimalist change. So Councillor Clark is totally correct in terms of the context of his ward. But Councillor Clark is not concerned about the other wards. Councillor Clark is not concerned about the other councillors. Even for the rural parts of the Shire, Councillor Egan and Councillor Ashton, all your ratepayers will have to drive through Diamond Creek. And if this strategy is implemented, you won't be able to get through Diamond Creek. We know that the public transport arrangements for Diamond Creek are exactly the same as Hurstbridge. I agree that Hurstbridge doesn't look to be badly affected, but Diamond Creek is a standout. And so I'm certainly not going to support this motion. That neighbourhood character study work has to be done. We have to look at putting some overlays over the rest of the Shire. That work was already done. It was done in 1997. The strategic justification is there, has always been there, and this is a poor process, and we need to do the neighbourhood character study first.
Thank you, Councillor Perkins. Any other councillors wish to speak? Councillor Brooker?
Thank you. I've got a similar view as regards the neighbourhood character aspect of what Councillor Perkins was talking about. You cannot proceed with a housing strategy independently from a neighbourhood character study. The two need to be done concurrently. That is what needs to happen. In terms of supporting the motion, I think I would support the motion, but with the proviso that we need to do a lot of work in terms of ultimately I wouldn't be accepting it without that neighbourhood character dimension. But I would say in terms of maybe a couple of broad points, the densities that is talked about, the greater densities in activity centres of Eltham and Diamond Creek ought to be quarantined around those activity centres, and they ought not be able to leak out into the other parts of Eltham and Diamond Creek. I think in broad planning terms, I think, and I've spoken about this before, I think one of the ways you want to protect pressure on the green wedge and you want to protect the green wedge from housing encroachment and pressure for housing in there is, I don't think simultaneous opposition to greater densities in those activity centres is consistent at all with that policy around the green wedge. I think it is the argument of, having all the benefits of one aspect of public policy without acknowledging its impacts on others. So, I would agree actually with the first 3 dot points that are listed in the officer report. Although I would say the Hurstbridge question, and it has been referenced tonight, will mean that some councillors, would have to, I would describe it as a flexible approach to that issue, given previous decisions. But what needs to happen is that it needs to proceed concurrently with a neighbourhood character study. The second last paragraph of the discussion paper states that. It says protection of our landscapes and neighbourhood character remains important. If it remains important, we've got to resource the neighbourhood character strategy. That is what we must do, because otherwise you do have a poor process, and you do get you're almost guaranteed of a bad outcome with a poor process. My ward, predominantly Greensborough, is Garden Court, and we need to protect and further drill down into what that means in Greensborough for Garden Court. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Booker. Any other councillors wishing to speak? No? Right of reply, Councillor Clark.
Thank you. Well, you can proceed on with a neighbourhood housing strategy. No one sought to propose it in the last 3 years. It costs over $200,000. Councillor Perkins has been here for nearly 8. He's all of a sudden discovered a neighbourhood housing strategy, but did nothing for 8 years. So to start to be critical of these things coming forward when you don't do the work strikes me again of hypocrisy.
10 years.
Well, it's even worse. You know, you're damned with your own praise. The point is, if people want to read the document, I agree that some terminology will need to be explained further. But what you are condemning this to by wanting to do a neighbourhood housing strategy in conjunction with this is that this strategy, nothing will happen for the next 2 years, because that's the time frame it's going to take to get that sort of stuff up. Having said that,
yeah, we need to do it right.
Excuse me, Councillor Brooker, be quiet.
You might want to do it right, but again, you've sat in your hands for the last 3 years. So all of a sudden,
you might not be with us.
Having said that, again, outside of the things that Councillor Perkins and Councillor Brooker tried to change by council officer recommendations, only those ones are the ones we've lost in VCAT. Again, we've been striking 100% batting average when we look at what those recommendations are, and we've been able to argue our case quite consistently at VCAT and winning. So to suggest that this is all of a sudden going to take a major drama is, again, nonsense. What we do need to find is some terminology in this which clarifies the intent, which isn't massive development. It is minusculely small. And then if you want to, proceed with a neighbourhood strategy, which is no problem in doing, but you don't have to stop the first part of the work to do the second part. This does not set up a whole bunch of opportunities to develop the Shire. Far from it, it controls it. I recommend the proposal.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. I'd remind all councillors that there are 23 other submissions that haven't been presented tonight, and to please make sure you read them to get an all-round view. We still need to vote on the issue as it is. Can I have a full screen, please? So all those in favour of the recommendation as per the papers? And that is carried. All those against?
Division.
Division called. All those in favour? Councillor Egan, Councillor Rankin, Councillor Clark, Councillor Brooker, Councillor Ashton, Councillor Demerick. All those against? Councillor Perkins, and that must be a first. So that is carried. Thank you very much. I'd just like to, before everybody signs off, we've got a whole room full of staff in front of me, all social distancing. I'd just like to thank them all from IT and governance for all the work that they've done to get us up on the screen. I'm just looking, we've got a 20-second lag on the screen, and all of a sudden all the hands went up. It was quite distracting. Getting back to what I was saying, I'd just like to thank everybody because they've done a marvellous job. We've even had Vince here all night from finance as well. So again, our staff are going way beyond the call in doing everything, and our wonderful CEO as well. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, councillors, for attending tonight at our first virtual meeting. Apart from that one glitch, which we will be able to fix for future council meetings, I think it went really well. So it'll be interesting to see the feedback when people are watching it. So thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll talk to some of you tomorrow. So there's no cups of tea afterwards tonight. I'll be having one when I get home. So good night, everybody.
Thank you, Mayor.
I now declare the meeting closed at 13 minutes to 11. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night from me.